Hello, hello, and welcome. Whether you're just starting your harmony course or you're reviewing for your upcoming exam, voice leading techniques and rules are an important thing to master. Today's lesson is for the intro level harmony student, but it's going to function as great review for you intermediate and advanced students as well. Now, before we jump into the content today, there's two important things you need to understand in order to comprehend today's lesson. You need to know what SATB is, and you need to really know what the definition of voice leading is. SATB. So this stands for soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and it's referring to the four voice composition. It mainly refers to box chorales, which is the basis of our content, with our soprano line being our highest voice, followed by your alto, then your tenor, and bass is your lowest voice. I've got them highlighted on the screen for you, but you'll also be able to distinguish each one from the other based on stem direction. Next up is the definition of voice leading. So this is the term we use to describe the movement as a voice moves from note to note and chord to chord, and how that relates to the other voices. What's really important here is that our voices need to be independent. So this means that if you were to sing it alone without the other three voices, it would be easily singable, it would sound good to our ear, and semi-interesting. Not only does it need to remain independent, but it needs to work harmonically and melodically with the other three voices, and that's where your do's and don't rules come into play. Today's lesson is going to work whether you're working with two voices or four voices, or you're completing a chorale or a keyboard style work. Alright, so in today's video we're exploring parallel motion don'ts. Parallel motion, it refers to at least two lines or voices moving in the same direction at the same interval. And I do want to highlight the word moving, because for these rules to be broken, the voices have to be moving, not repeating or holding. The two intervals you need to be aware of is the perfect fifth and the perfect octave. Why these two? Well, back in the Middle Ages, fourths and fifths were the preferred style, and if you were to hear them today, you would most likely recognize this as a type of chant or modal music, which is characteristic of that period. The type of composition we're studying in this level refers heavily to box chorales, and during this time period, equal temperament was the preferred tuning system that allows us to use all of our keys equally, and it focuses on major and minor tonality. So you've got to remember that it's the third and the sixth that highlight this tonality rather than the fourth and the fifth. Let's listen to some of these intervals so you can really understand what's going on. If I play the perfect fifth or the perfect octave for you, you're going to hear the two voices sort of blend into each other. This creates what we call a hollow sound. Now, if I were to play the third and the sixth for you, it's going to sound a little bit more interesting, and you're going to be able to pick out the two notes with your ear. This creates a more independent line because we can hear each voice clearly. So the rule here is you're allowed to use perfect fifths and perfect octaves, but you're not allowed to use them in the same two voices between the same two chords right next door to each other. The big question, how do you find them without taking an hour on each question? Well, the best advice I have for you is two things. The first and probably most important, listen to your teacher in the book when they mention voice leading techniques and your doubling rules. The reason why we teach these is to help you avoid the parallel octaves and the parallel fifths in the first place. There are two main techniques we use when moving from one chord to the next chord. The first and most common is to use a common tone and move the others in stepwise motion. And the second technique is to move voices contrary to the bass. So the common tone technique with stepwise motion means that if there is a note in common between the two chords beside each other, keep that note in the same voice and move the others to the next closest chord tone, preferably by step. If you find that one of your voices is leaping, especially leaping more than a third, then there's a couple of things I want you to look for. First, have you doubled things correctly? Second, is there another arrangement of the upper three voices that are smoother for all voices? Could you rearrange them to fix things a little bit? And third, is there a better inversion choice? Contrary to the bass technique is especially effective when there's no common tone or it's not possible to keep the common tone, or the roots of the chords are right beside each other. So going from a subdominant chord to a dominant chord, or the 4 to the 5. When you've got this kind of progression, parallel motion is very hard to avoid without creating a really large leap in one or more voices. And that's not the smoothest and easiest thing to sing. So in order to avoid this, what we do is we move the upper three voices contrary to the motion of the bass. If the bass is going up, move the upper three voices down to the next closest chord tone. If the bass is moving down, move the upper three voices up to the next closest chord tone. There may very well be a leap within one of the voices or more than one of the voices. It's usually minimal and you're gonna avoid your parallel motion. I also just want to pop in real quick to remind you to pay attention to any voice leading rules of resolution. So if you have a seventh of a chord, sevenths are supposed to fall by step. If you were to double the seventh of a chord, both notes are required to fall by step. You're going to end up with parallel octaves. So we don't double this note. The leading tone is also another note we don't double. More often than not, the leading tone is required to rise to the tonic. Some exceptions to that rule, but if you had two leading tones, not only are we emphasizing a really harsh and dissonant note within the scale, they're both going to be required to resolve in the same manner. So you're going to end up again with parallels. The second piece of advice I have for you is to develop a system or a way of doing things and be consistent with it. This way you master it. If you're writing out the parts, I recommend starting with two voices. Usually it's your soprano and your bass line because this functions like a skeleton of your progression. You're also going to be doing two-part writing minimally in your level 9 exam, but you will also do two-part writing in level 10 and ARCT a little bit more. So this is great practice for this. When you only got the two voices or your skeleton, it's really easy to spot if you have two perfect octaves or two perfect fifths in a row. And the other thing, again, you get practice with good two-part writing technique. And when you are writing two parts, we often avoid using that perfect fifth or the perfect octave a lot because of that hollow sound. So you can use those same techniques when you're working on your skeleton. Just don't use that interval a lot in those outer voices. Once your outer voices are complete, you're happy with the movement that both voices are creating, and you're also happy with your progression, head back and start to fill in your inner voices. And what you want to do is look for the octave, the perfect octave and the perfect fifth right from the get-go. So complete chord 1 and spot where the perfect fifth or the perfect octave is within that chord if there is one. As you go to complete your next chord, follow your common tone stepwise motion or contrary to bass, and keep an eye on that octave, that the octave does not remain in the same two voices of the following chord. Now there's a couple of important points to remember before we finish off today's lesson. First, the quality of the interval matters. A perfect fifth to a diminished fifth is not actually incorrect and is allowed in some scenarios, but we don't like it on the outer voices. So perfect fifth to perfect fifth or perfect octave to perfect octave. Those are the don't intervals. The second point is that compound intervals don't negate the rules. And what I mean by that is a perfect 12th functions exactly like a perfect fifth. A perfect 12th is a compound fifth. So even though they're further away from each other on the staff, it's still considered a perfect fifth. So we are not allowed to go perfect 12th to perfect 12th or perfect 12th to perfect fifth. Not that you would, because that's quite a large leap. And likewise, you are not allowed to write a perfect unison to perfect unison or perfect unison to perfect octave, because a perfect unison functions like a perfect octave. We're using the same two notes. So these are still don'ts. Don't do it. Another point I want to mention quickly is about sequences. Now, when you're writing out a sequence, there are some voice leading rules you're allowed to break if the sequence demands that you do so. But parallel fifths and parallel octaves are not one of those rules. You must still follow those rules when you're completing the sequence. And the final point, and this is really just a reminder, the intervals have to be moving. So a perfect fifth to a perfect fifth, if you're writing the exact same two notes, it's not considered wrong. It's not considered parallel motion. You have to be using two different notes. But that being said, remember we want our voices to be interesting to listen to, interesting to sing, and independent. And if you're repeating an interval over and over and over again, it lacks all of those things. So just be careful you're not repeating a perfect fifth multiple times in a row. That is all I've got for you today. I hope that this made parallel fifths and parallel octaves a little bit easier for you guys to understand. Make sure that you stick around and subscribe because we've got more harmony lessons coming for you soon.